Hey everybody, I just wanted to make this video to discuss Trump's sovereign wealth fund and where I think it could be heading. I think this is very important and people shouldn't undermine this because I think it can give us a lot of clues on what could be happening in the financial markets and how it can develop over time. None of this is financial advice. Please do your own research. This is just my opinion, okay? So none of this should be taken as financial advice. This is just my ignorant and humble opinion. Nothing to be taken seriously. So, the United States is in a very interesting position where it needs to globalize more. It needs China. It needs to do business with the world. And I think that a lot of the times the news sensationalizes a lot of things that makes it seem more dramatic or invokes more feelings of negativity for engagement, right? So just like social media in general, the whole purpose is to create engagement, not actually a net positive or for education or things like that. It's not supposed to benefit people over profit. So I brought this image up here, which shows 1990s Japan and 2010 China, where you see a lot of similarities between Japan and China, but as we see today, we have more positive relationships with Japan. And I think the same thing will happen with China as well. It's just that the news and media and the government and the private sector all need to, use certain types of narratives to maybe distract us from what's really going on. And it's always kind of been that way, right? And governments and the private and public sector can use narratives to distract us as, there's more complex workings behind the scene. And that's just history in general, okay? So I wanted to talk about Trump's sovereign wealth fund because I think it's very important. This is because the United States really wants Chinese assets like their stocks, businesses, infrastructure, and things like that, and their goods and resources, because the United States is financialized way too much. And I think a lot of these global developments we see was predetermined probably decades, maybe even longer. It's just that it depends how you look at it. Like, the slowdown of growth in the United States and the growth of emerging economies like China or Mexico or Latin American countries or Africa is actually a good thing. And it really depends on how you look at it, right? So if you are a nationalist, for example, of the United States, or you have supremacist ideas, you may want to secure that, even if at the same time it's at the expense of other people's well-being. But at the same time, we can all work together and we can all succeed and benefit from honoring things like the UN Charter and the Sustainable Development Goals, and everybody can find prosperity together. Or as China says, common prosperity. But understanding Trump's sovereign wealth fund is very important because it actually gives us a more better understanding of what Trump is actually trying to do, despite the rhetoric or the news or the mainstream media claiming a lot of things about what Trump is all about. Now, I think this is going to happen no matter what, if who is president, because this is just how there's numerous ways the global economy can develop, but for the United States, there's a realistic one, and the most realistic one is just taking a back seat and having the global economy develop where everybody benefits or nobody benefits at all. In a world where there's mutually assured destruction through nuclear arms, or global prosperity and everybody succeeds and wins together, win-win cooperation is actually the right choice. So despite what the media says about wars or trade wars or antagonism between each other, a lot of the times I kind of look past that because, throughout history it's happened, and there's either probable outcomes or there's like nobody wins at all and like the whole world just ends, right? And that's how I kind of look at it. There's either a probable outcome or one that's pumped up a lot, like mutually assured destruction in wars, but then everybody loses. So the most probable outcome, as we've seen throughout history, is just everybody winning and a global shift towards global equality, decolonization. And we've already seen this with rises of different countries and empires before, right? Like the British Empire. So, history is long, and it's very important that we understand these things so we don't get drawn and sucked into the sensationalist news that really doesn't help us understand economic history that can allow us to better understand the future. So, to start this off, the United States really needs China's help, and it's possible that when you look at Chinese equities and assets at this moment, while it has definitely bottomed, in my humble opinion, I think that now is probably the time where the United States and other sovereign funds may want to buy into the Chinese markets. And we've already seen this with companies like, not companies, but sovereign wealth funds like the UAE or the Abu Dhabi that used CVYN, their China holdings, to invest into companies like NIO, an electric vehicle startup company. That way they can gain success. They can gain a mutually assured success from the growth of the Chinese economy and the Chinese electric vehicle sector, because they're so heavily dependent on oil exports, and this helps them diversify their economy and stay relevant. So I think the United States is going to be doing something very similar in this sense, and we already see that with TikTok. And this is just one approach. So the United States can't sanction and tariff countries forever, because when we look at Russia is a good example of where sanctions just don't work. And rather than countries bowing down and being beholden to what the United States wants, they can just build economies away and supply chains away from the United States. And we see this with like the development of the BRICS or the Belt and Road Initiative, or how unsuccessful the sanctions on Russia has been, and Russia's been developing its own economies that's not reliant on the United States, and everyone suffers too in Europe, right? So everybody actually benefits from global stability. And there's been a few other countries that, like Cuba, for example, that's been sanctioned, but they are still existing. They seem to be doing okay, but everyone benefits from free trade if it's done properly. And to me, when I look at the trade wars going on, or whatever aggression that there's currently going on, a lot of it's sensationalized, and a lot of it is just hiccups in the road towards global development. And we've already seen this throughout history. So again, a lot of the assets and businesses that China has and owns, while the global economy could theoretically exist perfectly fine without the United States, the United States is in a position where they don't have leverage over the global economy, because the global economy, emerging markets, decolonizing countries, and the rest of the world would gladly build their economies away. However, if you were to do that, then there's mutually assured destruction, because containing the United States financial crisis, if they were to happen, is not possible, in my opinion. It would be something that can't be contained. If the United States really did have a crisis, economic or social crisis, it would lead toward a lot of social and economic crises. It would promote the United States to turn towards working against the Paris Agreement. It would promote economic migration out of the United States. It would promote wars and political instability, which is not beneficial towards anyone. So a stability of the economy, global economy, where everybody progresses slowly and towards prosperity, is actually the right choice. And I think regardless of the news, this is how it's going to happen. So the United States wants to grow, and they want to do business with China, but they want to share in the success of this growth. So by owning Chinese assets, by being partnered with Chinese companies, by owning them through sovereign funds, which could help them navigate a lot of bureaucracy, can allow for them to have a say similar to the UAE's wealth fund. It can allow them to have board membership on like companies like NIO or Alibaba or TikTok. It can allow them to have say in like how the company develops, and have dividends and have revenues and have profits from these companies benefit the sovereign wealth fund that's for the United States. So This is also beneficial to China because this will allow for China to financialize more and move away from real estate and into stocks. So Xi Jinping said that he wanted to pop the real estate bubble because homes are to live in, not for speculation. He intentionally popped the real estate bubble. And so encouraging Chinese citizens to invest in both real estate, save, and stocks is much more better for financial stability than relying on strictly real estate as a means of saving and investing. This would promote this way, Chinese companies can raise capital through the markets rather than government debt. This would also allow financialization of China's economy, where in their tier 1 or tier 2, 3 or 3 cities, or even other cities as well, and other zones, to better financialize and have more economic efficiency as well, because it allows for more fluidity, I guess, liquidity within the people of China, rather than things like real estate, which is kind of hard to borrow against, or maybe not as liquid, which can help investments and can help towards growing the economy as well, and can allow for people to better benefit from the wealth effect that's going to be created through the success of the Chinese economy. So it's kind of like if the Chinese economy was growing and they have stocks and assets that maybe they don't really want United States to invest in, I think it's going to be where the United States will have like a specific type of sovereign wealth fund to, again, cut through the bureaucracy. So this is good for China too, because again, it helps balance the economy, promote stability through the developments of their financial markets and people diversifying their assets away from real estate, so there's not as much bubbles, into something like the stock market, for example. So companies can raise capital instead, rather than government debt funding and things like that. And this is very important for more developed parts of China to, again, create wealth effects and things like that. And yeah, it just helps people share. So anyway, and China at the same time wants to expand into United States markets and their Western markets as well. But the thing is that everyone needs to prosper together. It can't be a situation where, like, again, the United States collapses and it's just not practical for global stability, as I've discussed, and it doesn't really honor the United States Charter as well. Rather, Chinese businesses like electric vehicles or manufacturing tech and whatnot, TikTok, things like that, or NIO or BYD, it'll allow for, at these current prices, the United States to buy them cheap, or at least buy into them cheap while they're cheap, and then realize gains with the Chinese assets appreciating off the United States and global markets. So it's kind of like if NIO was still at $60, or if TikTok was evaluated at 1 trillion, or Shein was at 100 billion or something, artificially suppressing the price, which is not really ethical, and some people may not agree with it, may be something the United States and other actors may want, so they can buy in cheap, like 5-10% of it, and then allow for increased liquidity and allow for more money to go back into it. And then then when it appreciates from substantially more, then they can benefit from that rise in the assets value as well, right? So I don't want to talk about ethics, but it's like if they want to, it's like with UAE, for example. If the UAE or Abu Dhabi government buys into NIO when the stock's priced around $8 and the market cap is low, then if they expect it to rise by 2 times or 3 times, then they can benefit from that gain, the paper gain, but then they can also buy into like things like the board of director and then mutually succeed together. So I know it's not really like ethical in a sense, like if you were to believe in free markets, but I don't really know if those things are really real, because everybody has their own agendas and things like that. I don't want to discuss that too much. So but yeah, this in turn would allow for the United States to benefit off China's growth, while allowing China to expand more easily into Western markets, creating like a situation where all boats benefit from a rising tide situation, not where someone is left behind and then like they suffer and then they have to like become super aggressive. The United States will most likely borrow money from the Federal Reserve and China and emerging markets. But what I mean is like the United States will probably borrow from the Federal Reserve in order to like create the sovereign wealth fund, and yeah, it'll be on debt, but I'm assuming that because of China's low valuations and the future prospects of China's economic growth, that we'll see China and the emerging markets that are within this United States sovereign wealth fund create a lot of profits and probably make up the debt pretty fast, right? So if you borrow money from the Fed, like a couple $1 trillion, and you invest into China and the emerging markets, they have such a high growth rate that, and with the way the global monetary system structured, I mean, the United States would benefit heavily off of this, in my opinion, and the gains would be a lot. The United States Sovereign Wealth Fund investing into Chinese assets with high growth and priced relatively cheap, in my opinion, with consideration to like global CAPE ratios, would allow for the United States to better manage its debts or possibly be profitable despite being debt funded. Probably be named the Trump Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example. He'll probably say it's his legacy and his only profitable thing, and so yeah, it really would solidify his legacy and things like that. So I don't think that the sovereign wealth fund that Trump makes is going to be easily accessible, as a lot of wealth funds aren't, but there could be a lot of indexes or things like that replicating it. But I think it'll be mainly traded through Trump coin. And unfortunately, whether you agree with this or not, I think if Trump coin really was issued by Trump, people will only have access through the dividends of this wealth fund immediately recognizable through a Trump coin, and it's appreciating value because within the sovereign wealth fund that Trump creates, it probably will consist of some cryptos, to much lesser extent than stocks, assets, and things like that, but it'll probably have Trump coin, and that's probably how Trump coin will appreciate and have value over time, because it'll be heavily tied to this sovereign wealth fund. I mean, not a large extent, but it'll appreciate based on the performance of the sovereign wealth fund, which I think he's going to make sure it does pretty okay or pretty well. So yeah, it'll probably be tradable maybe through a Trump coin of some sort, but again, not purchasable by common folk through easily accessible means like investing into an index fund or something. It'll probably be he would probably encourage people to invest into Trump coin to realize its success. So China has a lot of room to grow, as we all know, and so do a lot of the emerging markets, but China is in a unique position because of its skilled labor, its infrastructure, and things that can't be easily replicated, and takes decades of time to even do, and it's just not really worth the investment rapidly. So the United States wants a piece of that pie. If, for example, NIO or any other electric vehicle company or TikTok expand to the United States, or it'll create high revenues and it'll go straight to China. But this would allow for the United States to be an immediate beneficiary of the Chinese revenues from the US markets. The United States can also replicate what the UAE does by buying ownership of Chinese companies looking to expand, like, the UAE buying 20% of NIO, or around $3 billion worth, for an example. Just making up the numbers, right? I don't know if it was that, but it was around there or less. And this would allow for maybe avoiding the US bureaucracy or speeding up the process and allowing both China and the United States to be tied to the hip even more, but also encouraging win-win solutions rather than mutually assured destruction or one country being left while the whole world develops without it. So this would allow for China to grow in the West and globally while heavily being tied to the United States, increasing global interconnectedness and mutually assured cooperation and wins in the global developments. So like another example of a sovereign wealth fund would be like Norway's sovereign wealth fund, or Singapore's, which is a mix of stock, bonds, real estates, cash, and other assets. And we could see a United States wealth fund of 40%, for example, of stocks, or 20% treasuries, corporate bonds, real estate, liquid cash, and things like that. And while I do believe there will be cryptocurrencies and maybe some kind of like CBDC of some sort. Again, I would definitely see a Trump coin being one of the main parts that could allow for the populace to have easier access to this wealth fund, rather than being able to directly invest into it. This is because, again, they're generally not easily accessible. So yeah, Trump coin could definitely be maybe tied to the performance of the wealth fund heavily. And it can provide dividends or a UBI of some sort, especially as people are displaced from their jobs and just the complexity of a global development. So you can really use the profits from the sovereign wealth fund creatively, and you can use a sovereign wealth fund creatively as well. So I think, personally, if I were to, in my humble opinion, not financial advice, if I were to think about how Trump's sovereign wealth fund what it would focus on, what would it comprise? I think borrowing from the Federal Reserve and investing heavily into China and emerging markets, and select United States multinationals and U.S. companies that could benefit from more liquidity and funding. Though I think one of the best return on investments will be from China and the emerging markets, but more so China based off the CAPE ratios as we see here. I mean, it's so low. It's at around 14. Hong Kong is at around 8, while the United States is really high at 32. So, they might be looking at countries that maybe have better value right now and has better future prospects. The United States needs infrastructures, factories, and needs to reduce or slow down its debt accumulation. And a great hedge against the United States debt would be to produce actual value, not just financializing the economy and managing its debt in a way that's just putting one debt one way and then moving it around. Like, they actually need to create some value here. So I think that by allowing companies like NIO or BYD or Geely or Xiaopeng or Alibaba or Shein or TikTok and DeepSeek and all these other companies that are in China, or Tencent, it would be good to let them allow them to access the U.S. markets, because it would allow for inflation to cool down, because these goods are so much more affordable and the cost of living would go down, and there'd be more tech transfer jobs and more skilled labor and more joint ventures and better supply chain efficiencies, and these will all help cost of living go down while the quality of life goes up in the United States. So it would be heavily beneficial for the United States to have Chinese companies replicate the multinational United States companies into China. And this would heavily, and we've already seen this with Japan, right? So Japan in the 80s and 90s built their factories in the United States when the United States was having a hard time competing with them, like their Toshibas or their Hondas and things like that. So this would heavily help the United States benefit from transitioning towards a more efficient and green economy that honors things like the United States, the United Charter, the UN Charter, or the Sustainable Development Goals, and addressing concerns with the Paris Agreement. And it could also secure the economy by the United States and China by ensuring that countries like BRICS, or within the BRICS, don't leave the United States out of the global success and the global developments through a sovereign fund that allows for the United States to remain relevant and benefit from global growth, rather than being left alone, and then that wouldn't be good for anybody, because the United States can do a lot of damage. And this would allow for the United States not to be aggressive, go towards like their physical imperialism, or rely on very destructive neo-colonialist behaviors that really is unfair, and it's really hurting a lot of other countries. So the United States is kind of like an old man that needs a wheelchair, but it has like a nuke, and it needs to have a lifeline, and it needs a sovereign fund that could allow for that. And all the other countries that it kind of screwed over, kind of hurt, will have to push that wheelchair, but over time it'll be easier as the wheelchair gains momentum, and the person being pushed on the wheelchair will kind of like calm down. So everyone has to win together or no one wins at all, because we live in a really fragile world and there's time limits for existential crises. So we really need to focus on better management of the world and global equality and things like that, despite what the rhetoric is. Like the UN Charter and sustainable development is really important, and everyone adheres to this despite whatever you might see in the news. So this could allow for a thing like a UBI, or less burden on the debt, or a positive cash flow for the United States, and could create profits probably. But this in turn will also allow for the United States to benefit from global growth better, rather than, use like wealth extraction tools that really are hurting numerous countries in ways that are unimaginable. So, and not easily recognizable either. So a move away from neocolonialism into this type of thing may be better, though I think this is just one step, right? So we saw how the UAE sovereign wealth fund that heavily relies on oil, for example, invested into NEO through CYVN Holdings. So to move away and diversify from oil and other commodities, that it is a good thing to do, because things like oil or other commodities can be very volatile. And moving towards the future, markets like the electric vehicle and technology is really important to become part of, especially if you can't really compete with them. So the UAE invests in a company like NEO, so it removes a lot of the startup costs. It removes a lot of the need to develop things that maybe they don't have access to. It allows them to mutually win with them and have a say on how things are by, the UAE putting people into the NEO's board, or asking for certain kind of like planning, for example. So I think that like Trump's sovereign wealth fund, for example, could do something really similar, where they buy like a 10 to 20% stake in companies like TikTok or NEO or BYD or Shein, and this would allow for them to expand into Western markets more easily. But this also allows for the United States to have more of a say in how things are done and benefit from its growth, and expand into global markets, and makes it easier for Chinese companies to do so as well. So it would increase things like the relationship between the two and benefit economically together from global growth, and socially and technology from China's success. So I think that's probably the approach on why this Trump sovereign wealth fund is being made. I think it would have been done under probably any president, honestly, though. So this allows for everyone to win together and promotes things like common prosperity. So why not now like the UAE, right? Why not now like the UAE investing into Chinese companies, especially while Chinese companies remain relatively cheap? And it makes me wonder, are Chinese assets suppressed intentionally because this was the goal all along? Especially when you consider let's look at another. Now the Hang Seng isn't the only thing you can use as a reference, because the Shanghai Composite is doing pretty well. But in 2020, a lot of companies benefited, and a lot of Chinese companies raised capital at this time. So maybe we could see some signs of this going on here, where we actually see some better future prospects moving forward. Could they also be artificially suppressed prices within the Hang Seng with Chinese companies? Maybe, right? So they can secure a deal, buy in cheap, and then benefit from its gains. So I'll probably make another video on this later. Just wanted to share my quick opinions and thoughts based on today's news. Thank you.